Hi, and welcome to Makin Music, sponsored by Guitar Showcase. I'm Gary Wineroth from Guitar Showcase. With me today is Val King from King Amplification.
Hey,
Val,
Gary.
glad to meet you here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, listen now, Val, you've been repairing amps since you were a pup, I guess, or at least you had an interest. I know you used to come into Showcase when you were 10 years old.
Yeah, I first came into Guitar Showcase when I was 10 years old. I bought many a guitar and amp there over the years. As far as my electrical background, I built my first crystal radio when I was 6 years old. And over the years, I was the guy in the band always repairing the equipment.
Crystal radio with a little hairpin.
Exactly.
I had one. I didn't know you were that old. So you've grown to be a service center for like GK and Mesa Boogie and.
That's correct. We're
others?
authorized to do warranty repairs for Mesa Boogie, Gallion Kruger, Marshall, Vox, and soon to be Peavey.
Ah, okay. Are we working on Fender too?
Not at this time. Soon,
okay,
though.
okay, but soon, right? But now you do take care of all our old vintage Fender amplifiers.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, and today we're kind of talking about tube amplifiers because that is really your specialty.
Correct.
And you know, it's funny that the vacuum tube sort of went out 50 years ago, and it got to the point where, like on these Fenders and every other amplifier, where everything went to solid state. And I guess the reason was modern times, the transistor came out, and everybody thought, well, it does a great job and it will take the place of the tube. So everybody was talking about how the vacuum tube was dead. In fact, didn't we lose all our manufacturers in this country for a period of time?
For the most part, that's true. A lot of the manufacturers shuttered all their facilities, and manufacturing continued to be done overseas, most notably in Russia, where all their equipment was still based on tubes.
And they basically sort of figured out that tubes just sound better.
When it came to tone, there was no question that tubes were just much better.
That's right, and to this day, Fender makes tube amplifiers that are pretty much exactly like they were 50 years ago.
That's correct, yeah.
Marshall, Mesa Boogie, Vox, many of the old tube amplifier manufacturers are still making tube amps.
Still making tube amps to this day, and it's interesting that in a lot of places in the world, tube manufacturing equipment has been sought out, refurbished, and new companies have been set up to build tubes again. And the tube business is quite healthy industry, with a lot of companies coming into the market and a lot of new gear being based on tube equipment.
Are they making any in America now? I mean, do we have
there are a couple specialty companies and that are making tubes. They tend to be very high-end kind of tubes and very pricey.
Right. Well, you know, the music industry it's funny because we're one of the only industries left in this country where all the high-end gear is made in America. All the high-end guitars, all the high-end amplifiers, with a few exceptions. We have British Marshall and Vox, and but basically anything that's cool that people see on stage is made in USA.
Made in the USA, that's true.
That's all the gear. I mean, it's great. We even the PA systems and it's sought after by the foreign people. They come over and especially the Japanese, they love our stuff.
That's correct.
And they want to own it, just like they want to smoke Marlboros and wear Levi's,
That's right.
So it's kind of interesting. Well, now your shop, tell me what you do now. You service, I know you do a lot of stuff for us and you do some of the warranty stuff. So what exactly do we have some shots of the interior of the shop. You have some specialized equipment in that shop. If we could go to those shots.
We do. We have a lot of different test equipment that we use. Here's a shot of our showroom. We sell speakers and tubes and different amplifier accessories. In terms of test equipment, we have oscilloscopes, signal generators.
That's what this kind of stuff is here.
Here's our various test benches. A lot of things that we do with an oscilloscope. We can actually see more than we can actually hear. So we'll inject a signal into the amplifier to simulate a guitar. We can tune that signal to a single coil pickup, humbucky pickups, or P90 style pickups. And we can monitor the signal that comes out of it on the oscilloscope to detect problems and make sure the amplifier is running accurately.
So there's some caution involved with tube amplifiers. I mean, a little higher voltage, right, than you had on the old solid state stuff?
That's correct. A tube amplifier typically will have secondary voltages that are in excess of 600 volts, DC plate voltages that are in excess of 400 volts. At those voltages, one mistake can mean the end of your life.
We're dead.
Yep.
Okay, so don't try this at home. Let Val work on it. Okay, so that's an interesting, so high voltage is an issue. Does that voltage play into the tone at all, or does it have more to do with the fact that when we have tubes we get a softer distortion? We tend to get harmonics that are even harmonics rather than the odd harmonics that you get with solid state?
That's correct. Tube distortion in the preamp section primarily tends to be even order harmonics. It's a very pleasing sound to our ears. We tend to use terms like creamy, warm, smooth to describe that type of distortion. Right. Whereas the distortion that you might find in a solid state amplifier, we tend to use terms like brittle, sterile, harsh. It's difficult to quantify scientifically or in common language, right. So we have a vocabulary that we use to describe that.
Can you see that sort of thing on the oscilloscope?
You can see that on a waveform. When you look on an oscilloscope, there's a classic waveform for a Fender amplifier. There's a classic waveform for the Marshall type of distortion.
Okay. So you can see the tone.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of those things are like nuances. They're like the nose on wine and the aftertaste and the bouquet or whatever, the body. And so basically, the strengths of tubes. I mean, it's the tone, right?
It's the tone is what the real strength of the tube is.
They're more fragile than transistors, certainly.
They certainly are.
They get hot, so we have heat issues.
You got heat issues. The socket itself is a weak point in the tube architecture. The sockets become corroded and they can arc and snap and crackle and make noises.
Okay, so the noise is another...
Noise is another thing.
Is another issue.
The biggest downside of tube amplifiers is the maintenance that goes along with them. But the positive side is that the tone that you get from a tube amplifier just can't be replicated with solid state.
Right. You know, in fact, in our pro audio department, digital recording is the big thing now. But yet we sell tube preamplifiers to warm up the sound.
That's correct.
So that it doesn't sound so harsh and brittle. Now, so everybody spends all this money so they can get 0 to, light, flat response, and then we inject the tube to dirty it up a little bit so that we get that warmth and that sound that we really want to have. That's kind of interesting. Well, this is a good time. Let's listen to some of these differences. With us today, we have Terry Allen from Guitar Showcase, and we've got we've got 3 or 4 different ones. Terry, do me a favor and start with this Fender Bassman right here. Let's listen to that and see what that puppy sounds like. Now the Fender, Val, you talk about this amplifier. Is this essentially the same basic thing that they were doing in 1959?
It is. This is a reissue that's based on the 59 Bassman, and this is the quintessential tube amplifier right here.
So this is what, let's hear it, Terry. That's the tube sound. That's what we've heard in the 50s, and it can still be clean too. Clean. Yeah, cool.
And also, unlike some solid state amps, you'll notice if you ring in the harmonics on one string,
it stays there.
It's still there, and you're still hearing it. Sometimes on solid state amps, this note here will kind of disappear in the background.
Well, let's hear this old. This is from the what? 70s?
Late 60s.
Late 60s.
Late 60s solid state twin reverb amp.
Sounds okay, but it's just not the same.
Not quite the same. A little bit more sterile. Not as warm.
And how about when you hit it hard? They tried very, very hard. In fact, they were proud of that. You see it says solid state in about 48-point type in red letters there. They tried hard to emulate the sound because the guts in this amplifier occupy just a tiny little portion.
Tiny amount of real estate compared to what a tube amp would require.
And had to cost, what, a fourth of what a tube amp would
Probably about a fourth.
Yeah, so they really, and they sold it for the same basic, I think this sold for about $1,000 new back then, if I recall. We sold them at Guitar Showcase, and they bombed. They didn't do well. People did not accept this amplifier. In fact, it cost Fender some market share back then because people like Marshall, why don't you try the Marshall, Terry? People like Marshall were in fact still doing tube. Jim Marshall is still alive and he's still doing it.
Swears by tubes.
Yeah, he still does. Let's hear that guy. It sustains forever. That's cool. And you know, and that's a very distinctive sound.
It's a classic Marshall distortion
absolutely. Sound. Now, tell me the difference. How they have a different circuitry. They even use a different tube than, for instance, the Fender tube amps.
That's correct.
How do they differ?
Fender's amps have always been known for being very clean. The clean tone that you get from an amplifier is what all other amplifiers are judged against in terms of a clean tone. Fender has really not ever been known for distortion amplifiers, whereas Marshall is quite the opposite. Their tone is the quintessential distortion tone that everybody gravitates towards. It's very seldom that you find an amp that can actually do both of those tones.
In one package?
In one package.
Now they actually use different tubes, different circuits?
They use different tubes. The Marshall amplifiers tend to be EL34s or KT88 6550s, whereas Fender circuits are based on 6L6s or 6V6s.
These are power tubes?
Power tubes, yeah.
Okay. And preamp, they still use like a 12AX7?
12AX7 is the predominant tube you'll see in both amplifiers, although there's a couple locations on Fender amps where they use a 12AT7.
Okay, but a similar preamp tube, little bitty guy?
Yeah.
Okay. And then Mesa Boogie, which we'll do a show on, you know, actually later we're going to do a show on Fender and Mesa Boogie, and we'll probably have you along and do some of these. Terry, why don't you play this Boogie here? We have it set at what, the 15-watt setting?
15-watt setting on this Lone Star.
But this is Class A, Class AB?
This is a Class A amp, and it's switchable from 5 watts to 15 to 30 watts.
Okay, now when you say these different classes, what does that have to do with? Does that have to do with voltage or the wiring? Or?
The Class A is the operating state of the output tubes.
Okay.
A simplest way to describe that is it's actually conducting at all stages of the output cycle.
Okay. So it's always on, sort of.
The tube's always on.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, rather than switching back and forth or doing something different. Yeah. Let's hear this guy. Sounds great. So these are three completely different types of tube amplifiers.
That's correct.
And thank you very much, Terry. Should I hit the standby here? There we go. They actually represent the three basic markets for the tube amps. British for the Marshall, good old USA, and Fender is, of course, USA since, what, 1946?
46 was the first
46?
amplifier, yeah.
When Boogie started, what, in the 70s?
His background was in the early 70s, maybe even late 60s, modifying and repairing Fenders.
Kind of like you.
Somewhat like me, yeah.
You started, we're going to have the Val King amplifier.
I aspire to that someday.
It is called King Amplification, so we might do that. So he started out doing that, and then started building for his friends and for musicians that he knew.
Correct.
And it's just become kind of the choice of a lot of traveling musicians.
Very robust, well-built amplifiers. The original designs were actually adding another gain stage to the Fenders.
Okay.
The guys liked the Fender sound, but they couldn't get enough distortion out of them. So Mesa was the first ones to actually add another tube to get additional distortion out of a Fender.
Kind of like adding a pedal or a distortion pedal to boost that and it sounded great. I mean, so we get that kind of thing going on all the time. Well, let's talk about what makes these puppies tick. Now, you brought some tubes along here. This is an old tube caddy.
Yeah, I've got an old serviceman's caddy for tubes.
That's cool.
And let's see, I've got a few tubes here. Here's some JJ EL34s.
Now, who makes JJ?
This is a Slovakian company, and this is the brand formerly known as Tesla. And these are EL34s, which is a very common in the Marshall amplifiers.
Okay, and there's all kinds of giblets in here, but basically, I mean, from a technical standpoint, you've got a cathode, an anode, and then some sort of a grid.
A grid, and then a heater to actually heat up the plates within inside the tube.
So it fires up the electrons. They fly around in there, and the grid kind of slows them down or filters them? Is that, I mean, it's kind of...
The grid passes a signal from the grid to the plate.
Okay.
And during that passing of the signal, along with that electron flow, there's actually an increase in voltage or an amplification of voltage.
Oh, that's what gives us our increase in power.
Exactly.
Ah, cool. Now, with tubes, we have other things that we have to concern ourselves with. The power supply, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, tubes are more interactive. I noticed when Terry was playing, you know, when he hit it, it seems to react to his style, the bite, you know,
mm-hmm.
and how hard he hits those pickups. Why is that different? It seems to be a lot different. The solid state, no matter what he did, it just kind of, it was there. It was loud and it was there. There's no problem with the volume. I mean, it's got it, but it didn't feel interactive.
Yeah, the solid state equipment doesn't have the same dynamics. If you looked at the power curve of a transistor versus a tube,
mm-hmm.
a transistor power curve will be perfectly linear,
okay.
where a power curve on a tube will actually be curved. And that difference between those two curves is what we call compression. So with a tube amplifier, you can actually dig into the strings harder with your pick or your fingers, and you can increase the output and increase the dynamics of the amplifier.
Oh, I see. So it is interactive. Now the power supply too, doesn't it kind of draw down? If he really jumps on it, doesn't it kind of draw down that power supply?
The power supply will draw down in what they call sag, which translates to compression as well.
And that adds more of that dynamic.
More of that dynamic, correct.
That's cool. I mean, it sounds to me like there's some cool things
much
going
more,
on.
tube amp is much more interactive with the player than a solid state amp is.
Right, right. Well, let's talk about having to service these guys. Now, what do you do? If I send you over an old Fender amp, and like we do on a daily basis, it seems, you know, and I say, okay, check it out, what do you do?
Well, the first thing we're going to do is we'll give it a sound test and try to ascertain exactly what's wrong with the amp. We'll try all the different controls and see if we have scratchy pots, that type of thing.
Right.
From there, we'll go and we'll do a disassembly. Along the way, we're going to clean the cabinet, vacuum out all the dust and the cobwebs. We do that on the inside of the chassis as well.
Oh, you do?
You'd be surprised at how many amps are not working because of spiders within the potentiometers.
Bugs.
Bugs, yeah.
Yeah, really bugs.
Spider eggs, spiders,
yeah.
Worms.
Yeah.
We'll go through them, we'll inspect for damaged components, we'll look for resistors that are heat discolored, cold solder joints, and the like. In the case of a tube amp, we clean the tube sockets, we test all the tubes, we go through and we clean all the potentiometers. We use a two-step process where you use a chemical solvent and then a lubricant to make sure they continue to operate correctly.
So they do well. Now you mentioned earlier that the tube socket, I don't know if you have the tubes that have the prongs sticking out, they go down in the socket. You said that's kind of a weak point.
Yeah, so what happens here is the pins on the tube themselves will corrode,
mm-hmm.
and then the mating pins on the socket will also corrode,
mm-hmm.
and then over the life of the amp, as the tube's been inserted and taken out multiple times, the sockets themselves will lose their tension. So what we'll do is we'll clean the sockets and retension the sockets. Some cases the sockets have been worn so bad that we'll have to replace the socket.
Right, right. But you can do, now what's this little wazoo on top
this
here?
This is an 807 power tube. This is a military surplus,
mm-hmm.
and this connection on the top is the grid connection. So the signal coming into the tube actually comes from here.
Why'd they do it on top?
The reason they did that was to keep the noise-sensitive signal away from the high voltage of the other pins.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Just a way to make a quieter, more high-fidelity tube.
And that's a big puppy too, compared to these little guys.
Compared to the EL34s, it's quite a bit different.
Now, does it make any difference, the size? I mean, does it have to do with power? The bigger the tube, the more powerful?
Typically, the bigger the tube, the more power. The bottle of the tube, the glass envelope, they vary. They will change tone. You can find 6L6s that have the classic Coke bottle. You can find 6L6s that have the straight side.
And they sound different.
And they sound different.
Because those electrons are bouncing off in there. They're flying around.
Each tube from each factory around the world, they have their own characteristics in terms of the tone that they deliver.
You know, one of the things that affects the durability of a tube, it would be hard for people to see it, but there's a little mica, whatever you would call this insulator up here, that holds everything in place. And this has like 4 or 5 little prongs that on each side that hold it from rattling around. Now, I remember when they first came out with some of the Russian tubes, they had like 2 little prongs on each side, and if you hit it, or if you dropped the amplifier, the thing would just crash against the glass, break it, and that was the end of it. So And if you looked at the old Sylvanias and the RCAs and some of the GEs,
multiple contact points.
Multiple places to hold it. And I noticed this one has a beefy one at the bottom and at the top, whereas a lot of the older tubes only had them at the top. They didn't even seem to have much at the bottom.
When they first began importing Russian tubes, the Russian tubes to that point had really not been used in amplifier gear.
Right.
What happens is as that mica insulator loosens up and wears, the tube will become microphonic. You can tap on it, you can actually hear rattling that'll oftentimes get picked up and you'll hear it over the speaker.
We might get some harmonics we don't want.
That's right.
Now, why Russia with tubes? I mean, were they that far behind us in
Basically,
electronics?
they were that far behind us in the advent of transistors.
Okay, so when we went to it, like in our submarines and our airplanes and our military merchandise, did they actually still use tubes after, and radar and that sort of thing, well after we went to transistors?
They still did, and they still do to this day. There's a lot
50 years later, they're still doing it.
Industrial process equipment, military equipment, broadcast equipment, medical equipment that still use tubes in many parts of the world.
And in amplifiers, we went up to solid state and back down the tubes.
Then back down.
And they sound great, you know, and it's... So after you've cleaned up these guys, you've cleaned the pots, you've cleaned those sockets, you've pretty much checked everything out. Then what do you do as far as testing and verification? I mean, do you look at values, electrical values when you?
Well, what we do is we connect the amplifier to what we call a dummy speaker load of 2 ohms, 4 ohms, 8 or 16 ohms.
Whatever it's rated at.
Yeah, it simulates the load of the speaker. And we put the load on it and we connect that load to an oscilloscope where we can visually monitor the signal coming out. And then we inject a signal into the amplifier.
Right.
We fire it up. At this point, when it comes up to temperature and it stabilizes, that's when we'll set the bias. We'll typically power down and let it cool, power up again, and recheck the bias another time.
Well, let's talk about bias here now. Does that have to be adjusted every time the tubes are changed?
In the case of an amp that does have adjustable bias, it needs to be adjusted every time. Our policy is anytime we have an amp opened up, we're going to set the bias.
So you're going to check that?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that's something that's relatively easy once you have the equipment and you're opened up?
Well, there's specialized equipment, but once again, you're dealing with high voltage, and then there's also a calculation that we do that is a function of that high voltage to determine the right operating point.
And you actually plug these puppies in, and I mean, after all of this equipment and this dummy load and everything, you pick your guitar up and
then once the amplifier is reassembled, then that's the last test. Is we actually do a sound test with any number of different guitars.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So and I assume even though they're fairly delicate and everything, you do guarantee your work. And
we do.
Okay. What kind of?
We guarantee our work for 6 months.
6 months. Okay. So that's excellent. So they're going to work, and you guarantee they are. That's good.
One of the things we do is in the testing we use a signal generator, and the signal generator puts a signal into the amplifier in such a way that if it's going to break, if there's something wrong, it'll happen right on our bench. And the biggest difference is that when you strike a note on the guitar, that signal decays immediately, whereas a signal generator is on full blast all the time.
Constant signal.
Constant, yeah.
Okay.
And then the other thing we can do is if a customer is having a particular problem where the amp makes a funny noise at B flat or something like that, we have a chart that converts a note to a frequency, and we can dial that frequency into the signal generator and actually force it to make that problem in front of us.
Try to find the issue. Okay, cool. Because there's some science and some art involved here.
Part art and part science.
And it keeps going. Well, that's great. Terry, why don't you fire up another amp here and let's listen to that a little bit. Try the Marshall again, or whichever. What's your favorite here? You like the Boogie?
I think he's going for the Marshall.
Is he going for the Marshall? You know, Terry's band, you know, it could deafen me, I can guarantee you. But let's hear that Marshall once more. That's a great amplifier. That's a legend. it does them both. Well, thank you, Terry. Well, Val, have you got anything to add? We're running out of time here, so anything else we can talk about on these amplifiers?
Well, you know, an amplifier, it's a sophisticated piece of equipment. They need maintenance and care. One of the things to remember is they're in and out of the back of a pickup truck, and you got to be careful with them and don't bump them around too much.
Well, you know, that's good advice on any good musical instrument. I'll tell you, it's just part of the deal. Okay, well, I think it's about a wrap here today, and thank you very much for coming over today and helping us out with this. And hope to see you again when we do another one.
Glad to be here.
Terry, if you want to play a little more while we leave, jump on there. Come on up.
Go for it.
Go for it. Hit it. You might as well. Looks great. Go. Go.